Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. Federal Court and Canadian Superior Courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. I saw Nuxanor recently talk about Mr. Beast's recent drama he's gotten himself into with the whole AI thumbnail creator thing he made, and I personally don't really care about it. I see Nuxnor has a pretty reasonable attitude about it and pretty much said everything I would have said already. I've never felt Mr. Beast specifically is some huge issue for me, because ultimately, even if he's been trying to drive the general culture of YouTube to be geared more towards views and money, my influence and my overall realm of concern and activity in life extends far beyond the YouTube ecosystem. Like Nuxanor, I don't believe AI can ever really do what I do either. That was never really my concern. My concern has always been extremely selfish, mentally ill psychopaths and sociopaths trying to exploit me and manipulate me into being trapped into a life not worth living, trying to rob me of my soul and get me to give up on myself. I'm opposed to really cheap AI usage that causes a net decline in your cognitive facilities and or enables and or facilitates you doing unlawful and or generally scummy things you otherwise wouldn't have done, but I'm not entirely opposed to it in general. I agree with Nuxanor that responsible usage of AI can even potentially save your life, especially if it's being weaponized against you with irresponsible and possibly even criminal exploitation of it. Anyways, I don't think it's funny by any means, but I'm not particularly interested in and or inclined towards fighting for Iran's population having more American type views on homosexual rights and women's freedom to openly express their sexuality. So I feel like rhetoric around international politics other world leaders are concerned with has reached a standstill as far as what I care to contribute at this time. I guess I'll still keep an eye on international politics through Nuxanor's content, but I find it much more relevant to my life right now to discuss Kimmy's most recent stream. Now, I have nothing to do with the chatter Kimmy was addressing directly when she talked about letting go and moving on very recently, and I don't know what exactly drove them to comment in Kimmy's chat asking her for tips on it. I don't particularly care, but I wouldn't say it's a stretch to suggest that Kimmy was also extremely deviously trying to imply I should also be taking the advice she gave on the topic. I mean, she obviously didn't have any part of that stream she did where she gave the explicit direct public response to my last release that I demanded, so she's clearly chosen to now escalate this conflict even further and give me even more reason to sue not just her and her associates, but also the Canadian and United States governments for the ongoing, egregiously inappropriate treatment I've been getting forced to endure entirely against my consent. It seems Kimmy's really so unbelievably delusional that she seriously doesn't understand how someone of my caliber operates. I never let go of things in the kind of manner Kimmy described, holding a place in my heart forever and allowing that, but moving on with my life? No, that's not happening. You're either in my life and hold a place in my heart accordingly, or you are dead to me and completely lose all private access to my energy, heart, thoughts, and life. I don't tolerate anything in between. Maybe in the past, when I didn't even know what was really happening to me, I unintentionally partially allowed such a violation of my energy because I didn't even know how I'd really go about preventing it. I've developed systems and methods now to block and reverse it, though, and I intend to forever fully enforce them. I'm really serious about this. I seriously hope it doesn't, But even if it takes me another goddamn decade to attack and viciously shred apart every single egregious defamation of me that's happened in the last decade, with every little petty stupid thing Kimmy, Jamie, and everyone else says and does that exposes them for being the abusive, massive frauds they are, who are trying to literally exploit me to death all this time, I will expose every single goddamn lie day after day until I bring my wrath upon all of them and get the kind of widespread, explicitly evident public respect and recognition I know I deserve. If things are really going to goddamn continue how they have been, then that's clearly how I'm going to have to go about showing these absolute filth, not to try to endlessly abuse and exploit someone of my caliber and expect to leave me to die like they have and think they can get away with it and never have to comply with what I actually want and deserve, and also never even face any real, actually adequate consequences for what they've done. You think I sound like an asshole? You think I deserve to be murdered after being such a good person everyone's been trying to defame me to death to hide? You think I deserve to have to live in some kind of absolutely insane, egregiously inappropriate shame as if I'm a horrible person even though I did absolutely nothing to objectively deserve that? Kill yourself. Actually, kill yourself. I'm not goddamn joking. I'm not suicidal, and you're not going to make me suicidal. You're just going to make me disgusted with you and despise you and make sure you don't get to benefit from that extremely negative energy you're sending me. You are beyond stupid if you're going to even joke with trying to guilt trip me or something and call me an incel or some stupid garbage like that, and then tell me I'm being dramatic or stupid or obnoxious or should just shut up and accept how I've been treated and let myself get abused, disrespected, hated, and neglected to literal death. And even if you're not joking, I don't feel any differently about it. Clearly, these literal criminals thought they could beat me to literal death with psychological warfare and abuse, disrespect, and neglect, and just blame it all on my relatives and ex-friends and would-be romantic prospects if it didn't work out. But as Kimmy tries to only thrive off my suffering, with collaborating with Jamie increasingly as even more aggressive, unapologetically heartbreaking behavior, openly flaunting the destiny-swapping garbage Kimmy has been enabling and facilitating herself and others doing to me entirely at my expense, against my consent, all these years to siphon my energy and make it seem like I ever wanted, deserved, and or consented to it, starts to backfire harder and harder. It seems they're all really going to have to learn the hard way. It seems Kimmy's perhaps trying to imply there are things that I would like to let go of that I'm either unwilling or unable to. Completely false. I either don't want to let go of them, or I'm actively doing the absolute most at every given moment to most decisively and potently ensure I've fully let go of them, and there's absolutely no real ability they have to meaningfully re-enter my life. I don't live in some strange area in between, nor do I want to, nor have I ever really wanted to. Any even implications otherwise are to be considered egregious defamation of me, being done with utmost malice towards me, and being purported knowingly entirely against my consent and exclusively to my detriment. There's no holding space in my heart for this conflict or anyone involved, and just moving on with my life. I never questioned that there's a difference either. You know what that actually practically equates to if I did it? I always have, and I was never willing to do it, nor has anyone ever had any even remotely actually adequate reason to believe otherwise. Letting them all slowly erode at my reputation and willpower to live behind the scenes and use ritualistic, extremely devious defamation of me through their content and both online and offline activities. letting them constantly send hitmen after me while feeling increasingly justified in trying to convince the world I deserve to literally be murdered for being a good person, that they're egregiously trying to constantly karma swap with me, forcefully, entirely at my expense, against my consent, to shove all their negative karma onto me and steal all my good karma for themselves, forcefully to use me as an endless goddamn energy source to fuel their extremely selfish endeavors that they're intentionally, entirely excluding me out of. Anyone ever trying to act like I'm the type to tolerate that is a literal criminal and a massive fraud. The only reason it even ever seemed like I'd tolerate it in the past is because I hadn't adequately situated myself in every aspect of my life in order to most effectively and potently counterattack against it with utmost alignment with my values and desires in life. That's not laziness, naivete, mental illness, maliciousness, or some kind of weakness on my end. It's sheer calculation and extremely deep awareness of both my internal and external worlds. I've never asked or even wondered if Kimmy, Jamie, and or anyone else was going to Anime Expo and or any other expo. I don't go to those kinds of things, and I have absolutely zero real investment in anyone else ever attending any of them either. I never have, and absolutely nobody has ever had any actually adequate reason to believe otherwise. Any related egregiously false narratives otherwise definitely stem from Chloe's egregious criminal malicious behavior towards me, where she's been trying to extremely selfishly benefit at my expense against my consent, and then had that same kind of energy fed off of by Kimmy and Jamie and eventually many others, again entirely at my expense against my consent. The color scheme I saw from the art Kimmy showed, basically advertising her appearance at the expo, seems to indicate to me that Chloe and Celine's energy have heavy involvement in enabling and facilitating her and Jamie ultimately exploiting my energy enough to facilitate their own selfish goals towards it entirely at my expense against my consent. While I consider Celine's involvement certainly quite selfish, I again consider Chloe's that which is most blatantly, unapologetically, knowingly malicious on top of selfish. She's continuing to try to depend on me, being so exhausted, depleted, and feeling so miserable and scared and or tired of defending myself that I stay silent, but she's going to learn the hardest possible way what happens when you're so eager to wish death upon someone like me when they literally couldn't be further from deserving it. This isn't the first time that Kimmy said that she considers Jamie one of her supporters from day one. I've never been trying to argue whether or not that's true in case that was for some reason being questioned. I myself wouldn't say I have anyone that supported me from day one, so I'm not really sure how it would feel to have such a person, but I also wouldn't say I'm jealous either. After all, it seems to me that Kimmy and Jamie actually have a secret, massive jealousy dynamic between them that they've been trying extremely hard to project onto me entirely at my expense against my consent. They've both been trying extremely hard to make the other question the reality of my feelings and position towards each of them, even when I've repeatedly been explicitly saying it extremely clearly and trying to make it as clear as possible. While I can't say I supported Kimmy since day one, that's because I also didn't know she exists until she'd already been streaming for over a year already. I'd been too focused on self-improvement of my mental framework and video game development. I did start supporting her after she'd only been streaming for about a year and a half though, which is still really early on, and she was a much smaller streamer that only got about 200 or 300 views a stream at most on average back then. Shortly after I joined Kimmy's community, I also very quickly cut back on and eventually entirely stopped supporting all other content creators of any kind who I'd been following and engaging with. I'd already decided I wanted to pour all that time and attention into just her because I took my connection with her extremely seriously. Maybe it didn't seem like it because I tried to be lighthearted and easygoing, but it's true, and I know I have proven it, and there's absolutely zero real evidence to substantiate assertions otherwise. I don't know if Kimmy somehow holds it against me not to have supported her from day one, but she hasn't supported me from day one either, and I've never held that against her. I mean, it's not like I ever expected her to go out of her way to talk to me without me even showing any care for her, just to tell me that she was hearing gossip about me, or to randomly obsess over me and come off desperate or something like that. But I also very much clearly differentiate that from entirely relinquishing her of any responsibility whatsoever for not communicating more clearly with me early on after I'd clearly shown interest in her that she very obviously shouldn't have taken lightly by any means. From the beginning, when I talked to her in Discord DMs, I was very straightforward and honest with her about how I felt about her and how seriously she should take those feelings I explicitly told her I have towards her. I most certainly find very much substantial fault in her for clearly taking too much pleasure in carelessly playing with my emotions and knowingly choosing to only make what she clearly saw was an extremely difficult situation even more difficult for me for her own selfish gain. I've never done that kind of thing to anyone, and there's absolutely zero real evidence otherwise. I find Kimmy questioning if Pearlie is a serial killer to be an exceptionally passive-aggressive and deviously motivated move from her. However, I also can partially understand where it would be coming from. Pearlie randomly got thrown into this chaos long ago, and it was another kind of extremely difficult situation for me to try to deal with. There reached a point where it seemed evident to me that egregious false narratives about me were being perpetuated in relation to her, but it seemed I was at a loss whether I directly contacted her in any manner or not. Not adding her to my mailing list made me seem like a coward and fraud trying to hide things from her, and adding her made me seem, at the very least, disingenuously, romantically, and or sexually interested in her. I've never been trying to call Pearlie ugly as far as physical appearance, but although she's a decently physically attractive Korean woman, I've never found her exceptionally attractive either. I assume she seemed like a good target to defame me through as a result of the combination of her being Korean, at least decently physically attractive to an extent, perhaps being framed as something I'd consider more suitable as that of someone in my league, living in Canada, so as to seem not to have as much of a physical distance barrier as someone in an entirely different country, and being an artist which likely attempts to hijack and exploit egregious false narratives about me in relation to Chloe, which likely attempt to portray me as someone who's ever been particularly inclined towards individuals who do some kind of drawing, painting, and or computer graphics type artistic stuff. Now, if we're to assume Kimmy was secretly pulling the strings behind it all along, and herself trying to fabricate leverage over me and Pearlie in order to control her and ultimately use her like a pawn in her plans to start a candle business, then my position on Kimmy's behavior should be rather evident. Absolutely repulsive. Scum like that truly deserve to be called subhuman filth and humiliated, shamed, cancelled, and have their lives destroyed as they wished to destroy others. Massive narcissist and truly the epitome of the kind of poisonous, demonic energy vampire the world is truly better off without. Intentionally steal people's light and energy and unapologetically leave them worse off than they found them, and then try to attack them so viciously anytime they stand up for themselves that they try to intimidate and scare the victim away, basically literally terrorize them, even trying to threaten them with legal action and even physical violence until they cower away and let these kinds of predators act like they were the victim all along, and then use this disgusting wording like leave space in your heart forever but have to move on with your life. What the hell is that? Leave space in your heart forever?
So let your energy be drained forever by something not adding any real value to your life and not positively affecting you at all? That's a goddamn disease. And of course, the goddamn disease itself tells you to just live with it. Actually, a serial killer with their actions and then tries to guilt trip and twist any and every word said to turn their victim into seeming like a serial killer. But I'll calm down a bit and take a step back for a second to put everything into perspective more, because it doesn't feel right to me to just hammer on Kimmy like she's the entire problem and absolutely nobody else participating in it all has any part in deserving blame as well. I find it exceedingly difficult to imagine Kimmy's completely clueless as to what she's really doing, but she's also practically certainly incapable of doing it entirely on her own, at least from what I can tell. It's becoming increasingly evident to me that Kimmy and Jamie have intentionally manipulated and exploited this artist Pearlie, and perhaps even she herself intentionally went out of her way to get involved in attacking me for selfish gain, and that's how Kimmy's so close to Pearlie and making her do art for her candles. Again, like every other egregious defamation of me, there's absolutely zero real evidence to substantiate any assertions that I've ever at all consented to any degree of perpetuation of narratives that I ever have been, or even ever wanted to be, at all romantically and or sexually involved with Pearlie. At most, I imagine there would be some kind of extremely loose, falsified garbage that attempts to egregiously manipulate and warp some kind of framing of me ever having mentioned her or interacted somehow at all with her ever, trying to subject me to entirely undeserved consequences of some kind of egregiously false pretenses that were established entirely at my expense against my consent. I imagine there's probably some kind of narrative warping and attempted guilt tripping Kimmy's deviously trying to do, coercively trying to force Pearlie to play nice with her to try to clear Pearlie of accusations of intentional involvement in conspiracy to murder me. In reality, she will never achieve such a thing by simply sucking up to Kimmy, Jamie, and or any of their associates. It does absolutely nothing to benefit me, and I'll never let any of the people involved escape my wrath, to which Pearlie most certainly is not, never has been, and never will be at all an exception. Kimmy's also probably trying to extremely deviously guilt trip me as if I came off scary like a serial killer from the beginning as some kind of justification for hating me, and also trying to weaponize my own words against me about my traumatic experience at a homeless shelter I mentioned a while back, where someone quickly labeled me a serial killer guy just for standing up for myself with courage against his clearly intentional intimidation tactics. I never mentioned that to validate narratives that anyone actually had good reason to believe I'm some unhinged serial killer. There's absolutely zero real evidence I've ever actually killed or even at all intentionally contributed to somehow causing the death of anyone. That being said, I feel absolutely no shame whatsoever if I'm going to be seen as a serial killer of serial killing narcissist psychopaths that prey on innocent victims and try to endlessly siphon their energy for selfish gain, as it seems only increasingly clear with every passing day that Kimmy's been hoping she could successfully do to me. While those I'd be killing, or at least contributing to the death of somehow substantially, are literally just a poison that ultimately do more harm than good to the world, I'm actually the complete opposite of them in that case, since leaving those toxic energy vampires allowed to thrive literally only erodes at the world and makes things worse for everyone that isn't subhuman filth like them. I'll never feel any shame, guilt, and or other negative emotions about it, and most certainly not indecisiveness. Comply or die was never blackmail. It was a psychic prediction. Again, Kimmy mentions that she met Jamie at 16 years old. For some reason, that seems to be quite relevant to her desire to make Jamie's company proud, given the cap from a collaboration between Emaine and Jamie's company that Kimmy wore again that stream, not for the first time while Kimmy was trying to bully and discredit me, might I add. When considering how I've been given reason at this point to question if Jamie was really 17 and not 18 when I met her, I see reason to suspect that intentionally hiding Jamie's real age from me when I met her, in efforts to substantiate claims of me being a pedophile somehow, substantially relate to narratives conspiring to murder me, which have served as at least part of the foundation for Jamie starting her business Ebico, which is only becoming increasingly suspiciously relevant to all the efforts Kimmy's been engaging in to discredit me and destroy my life. Maybe, perhaps even more likely than Jamie being underage when I met her, there might be egregious false narratives that the reason I wasn't more interested in Jamie was because she wasn't underage when I met her. My behavior was only really friendly with her, and to say I was flirting with her seems at least a little disingenuous to me, but it never really mattered to me how old she was. Like I've been saying, I only ever really attended that meetup because I wanted to meet Kimmy. I wasn't trying to be particularly friendly or particularly mean to Jamie, but I also hadn't come to particularly meet any of the other people there that weren't Jamie, so my options on how to interact to not come off extremely awkward were quite limited, at least from how I saw things. My conscious desire to not come off extremely awkward was just as much about myself enjoying the experience as it was for others, so it wasn't some super people-pleasing thing either. It should be noted that there's no real evidence to substantiate assertions of me having any hidden motives to have any issue with Jamie's business, and I've never felt and or expressed any jealousy towards her business either. The only real issue I've ever had with Jamie is her contribution to malicious attacks conspiring against me to destroy my life, which I've never seen adequate reason to believe she's fully consciously and intentionally the primary or largest contributor to overall anyways. If Kimmy hadn't been attacking me so viciously that her behavior made it evident I need to pay closer attention to Jamie and address things related to her more meticulously, especially when Kimmy interacts somehow with them, I would have kept basically just leaving Jamie alone completely, or at least not giving her any particular attention compared to the several others I've seen reason to suspect have substantial involvement in conspiracy to murder me. This is now also not the first time Kimmy saying Juniper does not have an aggressive bone in his entire body, and that seems to me like a suspicious, deviously alternative meaning communicating thing somehow. If she's trying to suggest whoever she might be trying to represent through dialogue around Juniper is someone that's ultimately harmless to her, then it definitely can't be me. So it's probably Big Skenger. Since Chloe's egregious defamation of me has probably resulted in my energy getting mistaken for Celine's, at least in some cases by at least some people, that means since Snowball probably represents Celine somehow to Kimmy, I should be careful not to let her try to pass false narratives about me through Snowball either. I don't feel my relationship with Kimmy has changed at all ever since she got Juniper, nor do I feel my desire for attention from Kimmy has changed at all ever since she got Juniper. Nor do I see such changes ever occurring in the future as a result of Kimmy getting Juniper either. At this point, I find it perhaps worth noting that I have indeed been sleeping and possibly even fell asleep in many cases during times when Kimmy was streaming. However, I want it extremely clearly known that I have never and do not associate or credit any of my ability or reasoning for why I fell asleep or was able to be sleeping at all peacefully to Kimmy streaming ASMR or in general trying to bring a pocket of peace or whatever of some similar nature that she claims she's supposedly been trying to do for her audience. I consider my ability to have peace enough to be able to fall asleep and get decent rest to be entirely a consequence of my own efforts to defend myself against those attempting to deprive me of achieving that state, and I actually consider Kimmy one of those who's been, at the very least, carelessly enabling and facilitating others to attempt to deprive me of achieving that state, if not herself also actively contributing to attempts to deprive me of achieving that state. And I'd say she's actually one of the more substantial forces attempting to deprive me of achieving that state, actually, and just presenting herself as the type to typically do the complete opposite as part of her brand in order to attempt to overall discredit me. I found it quite strange that Kimmy said she feels like a fortune cookie. I have no reason to believe that I will receive something like a knock on my door at 4 p.m. on June 27, nor that anyone will be giving me free boba at any point in time. Nobody has any actually adequate reason to believe that June 27 has any particular meaning to me or that I'd have any particular expectations for anything to happen to me on that date, and I've also never said or done anything that should even remotely suggest to anyone that I have any kind of particular fixation with getting free boba in general either. I've also never been looking for Kimmy and or anyone else to even attempt to predict the future in such a manner in relation to any event occurring. With Kimmy feeling compelled to say she is just chatting in whispers, I feel compelled to explicitly state that, much in the same manner which I have never particularly been looking to have Kimmy do ASMR, I've also never been particularly looking to have Kimmy do just chatting in whispers. While I have no reservations to admit that I initially tried to provide Kimmy with what I hoped was constructive feedback on her ASMR when she first started making it early on after I entered her life, I was simply trying to show her I care about her, not trying to imply or suggest or push for any kind of fixation or obsession or whatever with ASMR or whispering or similar things. Again, I'm not trying to pettily hate on Kimmy for doing it, nor am I trying to say it sounds bad. I'm simply making sure my position on it all is extremely clear and no one is able to effectively falsify some kind of leverage or control over my life through false narratives in relation to it. I found it strange how Kimmy felt compelled to basically randomly say that her favorite member of the K-pop group Twice is apparently Momo. I don't know why she felt compelled to say that exactly, nor what hidden meanings it probably has behind the scenes. I myself do not have any favorite member in the K-pop group Twice, nor have I ever. I actually don't have any favorite member in any K-pop group for that matter, nor have I ever. I definitely can appreciate K-pop and enjoy listening to it in general more than most genres of music for sure, but I've never felt compelled to particularly fixate or obsess on any specific group, nor any specific member of any K-pop group or K-pop artist in general. I want it to be extremely clear that absolutely none of my frustration has anything to do with Kimmy's recent streams being shorter than usual. It gives me less material I have to go through to figure out what egregious false narratives I have to expose for the lies they are. What does upset me, however, is that Kimmy finds it appropriate to obsess over working on boothing at Anime Expo with Jamie instead of at all communicating properly with me. I wasn't ever under the impression that Kimmy's last stream would be the last stream she ever did, or the last content she'd ever post in general. That being said, again, I haven't been trying to help her to have some kind of retirement from content creation while she continues to do absolutely nothing actually benefiting me in the manner in which I want from her. I've made it abundantly evident what kind of behavior from her would actually benefit me, and she's doing absolutely none of that kind of behavior. It makes absolutely zero difference to me whether or not Kimmy updates her Discord server with how her candle business is going and or random life updates and or whatever else. If she's not directly communicating with me in an adequate manner, which necessarily requires her reaching out to me first, then absolutely no communication she's doing of any kind anywhere is anything I'd consider at all actually adequate to alleviate any burden of responsibility from her in this conflict. Also possibly worth noting is that I've now lost access to my official Discord account because my old phone was logged in but isn't really usable anymore, and I can't get the new location login email if I try logging in to be able to access it on any other device. That was Kimmy's latest going live post she made on her Instagram story when she went live most recently. Again, the murderous white heart emoji energy of the Jamie, Lily, Arya trio that has been conspiring to murder me with a demonic entity they have summoned for Chloe because she's trying to have me murdered to cover up all her egregious abuse, defamation, disrespect, neglect, and crimes committed against me that Kimmy and her associates have clearly extensively helped with. Effectively, every time Kimmy uses the white heart emoji on her socials to indicate going live, it's a public official indication that her content therein is intended as a massive, unapologetic, public official enabling and facilitation of efforts conspiring to murder me, and absolutely none of Kimmy's behavior up to this point is anything that's at all convincing me otherwise. This is far from the first time she's used it, even just in the last few months. And this is also not the first time I'm documenting it on this podcast either. I can draw conclusions from the platform she uses it in posts on as well, showing significance to the involvement of specific individuals existentially assaulting me. Instagram is owned by Meta, which is the same company that owns Facebook. Facebook is the first platform Chloe started publicly engaging in existentially assaulting egregious defamation of me, extremely deviously, extremely narcissistically trying to endlessly siphon my energy entirely at my expense against my consent, with the help of Jerry and Herman in order to facilitate Chloe's extremely selfish desires to extremely dishonestly start a business entirely at my expense against my consent, where she was trying to ruin my life and steal my professional opportunities from me that I'd been working so extremely hard to earn in an extremely honest manner. So Kimmy's stream was a more direct existential attack on me that Chloe directly benefited from and tried to frame me for harm done to others by her through, which was something she was doing fully, consciously, and intentionally, entirely against my consent and entirely to my detriment. Actually, if we look at Kimmy's Twitter, she made a tweet the same day, but not about going live. So now the company Chipotle is involved in a conspiracy to murder me, and they can directly thank Kimmy for making that extremely apparent to me. Since it was exclusively handled on Twitter, this to me indicates it's highly likely to be originating from a fundamentally different energetic source of existential assault that is operating separate from Chloe, which I believe would be the Jamie, Lena, Imean trio. Depending on the dynamic, maybe they could be considered a proxy terrorist kind of situation for Kimmy, similar to how Kimmy, Jamie, and Celine are in a kind of proxy terrorist situation for Chloe, and how they all exert extremely malicious and exclusively negative influence on my existence. Perhaps unrelated to that, but recently, my old Android phone basically broke down beyond really being able to be used. Just yesterday, one of the staff of a government building I frequent happened to have an extra old iPhone 6 Plus that he gave me for free after I told him my phone is broken. That same staff member just so happens to be named John and is an older Caucasian man. Prior to giving me the iPhone I now use as my main and only real phone I actually can use, all he's ever done for me, really, is let me stay inside that government building a little later than most people are usually allowed to stay, which is something that all the other staff members have also very long been aware of and also allow even when he's not working. Long ago, he used to sometimes also bring me boiling water to use for coffee, tea, and making some food if I had it, like instant noodles, but apparently someone higher up in that building told all the staff not to do that for me anymore quite some time ago, so we both agreed that I won't ask him for it anymore because I don't want to put his employment in jeopardy. I am not, and I've never been in contact with any staff members of that government building outside of the scope of me being in that government building. To make sure I'm being extremely clear, I've never seen and or interacted with John Sade in and or around that government building. Today, things only get stranger. While walking for fresh air and making a visit to a plaza I regularly walk by to briefly check the garbage bins for potential food, I noticed something in the exact same garbage that I was approached in front of by the strange woman I've talked about before on this podcast who gave me $5, who I suspect was an undercover government agent. Nobody approached me around it today, but I noticed an extremely suspicious green bag containing what seemed to me to be several grams of cannabis. I did not touch it, nor even attempt to dig in that trash bin at all, since I noticed it even after a brief glance inside the trash bin and instantly felt extremely suspicious of the situation. I left the plaza, and upon making another visit a few hours later, I briefly looked into the same garbage bin and the green bag was gone. I have no idea what happened to it, and I don't particularly care either. At this point, I suspect that John Sade is trying to frame me and set me up for different kinds of drug-related incriminating evidence to be somehow created of me that attempts to frame me as somehow at all knowingly and or consensually involved in his drug dealing and trafficking and other related type criminal activities, which he is attempting to somehow hold as some kind of leverage over me to justify the egregious exploitation, abuse, disrespect, and neglect that I have experienced by him, Mary, Dixon, and other members of that family. I'll be increasingly careful to avoid ever providing anyone with such evidence, and I want it known that anything that could be seen as such evidence that I've already done was never intended as any kind of cooperation with anyone in that family, nor will ever amount to any actually solid evidence of any of the egregious lies they've been trying to purport about me. Spiritually, I recently came across an energy talking about someone that claims they lied to protect me is trying to escape accountability, but they will be caught as long as I speak up. I'm hearing they've been trying to silence me, either literally or metaphorically, and I would say it was most likely literally, as in at least one of the hitmen sent after me was most likely because of them, and that this overall effort by them to silence me may have been happening for years. They betrayed me and made a decision that would essentially, or at least potentially, ruin my life, and did so supposedly for what they claim to be for my protection. In reality, from what I see, they actually made a decision that they knew was entirely at my expense against my consent, that they tried to intentionally hide from me. They effectively tried to rob me of my soul and eliminate any real free will I would have for their own protection, to attempt to endlessly perpetuate their selfish endeavors conspiring against me, which probably ties into the egregious criminal power of attorney scam that I've been hearing is attempting to make me seem unfit to make judgments about my own life in court in order to rob me of perhaps some kind of inheritance. This same behavior that attempted to deprive me of free will most likely is related to the current, ongoing, extremely detrimental, life-threatening deprivation that I continue to face despite speaking up for myself how I have been on this podcast. I'm not sure if it's the same person or entirely a result of just their efforts and intentions, but I'm also hearing that people have literally been getting paid to keep me in poverty. That's never been okay with me at all.